And welcome back to the Neurodiverging Podcast. I'm Danielle Sullivan. I am your host. I am so excited to be back after our little summer hiatus. To bring us back with a bang, I'll be talking to Todd Ellis, an ADHDer who's been at Microsoft for 20 years and has just finished training as an ADHD coach. We had so much to talk about. We had trouble staying on topic. It's a great show. Before we get to that, I just want to thank my patrons for supporting this podcast. The podcast runs on patron donations, and if you are interested, I encourage you to please check out patreon.com/neurodiverging. You can find out more about how to pledge to the Neurodiverging Podcast to keep us running, keep us in business, get some very excellent behind-the-scenes perks. The Patreon is at patreon.com/neurodiverging. Pledges start at just $1 a month, and you are supporting the podcast, the website, and underserved neurodiverging clients who could use the scholarships to access coaching. So it is very appreciated. And a quick plug, of course, for the website at neurodiverging.com, where you can find articles about neurodivergent issues, full transcriptions of the podcast, and a list of upcoming events I'm hosting, the vast majority of which are free or low cost. I do monthly webinars, I host support groups, I teach classes, so come join us. Now let me tell you about our guest, Todd Ellis. He has been at Microsoft for the past 20 years and is a co-lead for a global group of neurodivergent individuals within that company. He's also ADHD, dyslexic, and has just finished his training as an ADHD coach. Todd co-hosts the Schooling Struggle podcast, link below. Please check that out. And our conversation ranged from how to approach neurodiversity and accommodations in a multicultural, huge company like Microsoft, to what it was like for Todd to be diagnosed ADHD as a kid, but not really dig into what it meant until middle age, and how we each got into coaching and why we do it. Plus, lots and lots of other diversions, hopefully of the amusing and educational persuasion. You will have to let me know. Enjoy.
Hit it.
Ready?
Let's go.
Todd, welcome to the Neurodiverging Podcast. It's good to see
thanks
you
for
again.
having me. Yeah.
Thanks for being here.
How's it going, Danielle?
It's doing okay. As we were just talking about, it is evening here. I've had a full day of coaching clients, so I'm feeling a little like, let's go
Ready
with fun.
to be done?
Ready to be, but also very excited to talk to you because we've met briefly before and talked a little bit, but it's nice to see you. I think it's been like a whole year, hasn't it?
It's been a COVID speed bump.
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
Yep.
Exactly.
It's been a while for sure.
All right, though.
Yeah.
So what's new with you? What's going on over there?
Well, aside from COVID, what do we call it? The blur? Oh, yeah. So funny people talk about, they're like, oh, remember when this started? I was like, no, I don't actually remember when that started. Really nothing's new. No, I think we talked about ADCA. So I finished my coaching class anyways. Haven't got accredited yet, but that's something that I was following up on. And then still just enduring the day-to-day of life and this new normal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are you still working at Microsoft?
I do work at Microsoft. Actually, what's today?
The
6/23. So on 7/22 of 22 will be 20 years that I've been working at Microsoft.
Wow.
I know. That's what I said.
That's amazing.
I even sit back like, wow.
Congratulations.
Yeah, thanks. I never thought I'd be there for 6 months, let alone 20 years.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, especially in that kind of realm of jobs, people jump every 2-ish years or so, right?
Nowadays they do for sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Maybe not when you started.
Yeah. No, I don't know. Like that, there needs to be a thing where the jumping was, that's kind of with the newer, now I'm dating myself, with the young kids, the newer generation, like, their interests just take them, well, and I think the industry supports it too, but their interests take them in different ways. And there's so much to do in that industry that, jumping around just makes more sense. Plus, if you want to go for the money, you have to jump around sometimes. So
I mean, yeah, absolutely. That's kind of an important, especially for people starting off and just getting into their career, right? That you need an income. So yeah,
absolutely.
So you're an ADHDer. For folks who don't know you, you're an ADHDer. You've just completed kind of the initial part of your program to become an ADHD coach. You've been at Microsoft for 20 years.
Yep.
What else should folks know about you as we go into this conversation?
Yeah, I have ADHD and dyslexia, and I've been that way probably since I was born. But I got diagnosed when I was 8. I'm 46 now, so it's been a while. It's been a minute that I've been knowing that. And I've taken a lot of drugs to deal with that in my life. I have 4 children and 2 grandchildren. My youngest son is 19, so I'm again, aging myself. I have 2 redheaded stepchildren, which are going to be just like me, which is obviously terrible. Looking at that, I realized that one of the blessings of grandparenting that you don't know it. Well, I didn't know. You don't know ahead of time is that it will expose glaring gaps in your own efficacy as a parent, and so those are now becoming very evident for my daughter and myself. So that's kind of funny. What else? I'm never going to commute back to work again. Decided that.
Yeah.
So
I
that's
can't
gonna be nice.
imagine
Yep.
going to an office situation ever.
No, definitely not now. Thank God
Yeah.
for the pandemic, right? Like look
Right.
what we finally found. We could be equitable. That's fantastic. And gas prices, at least here, I'm in Seattle, and we're nearing $6 a gallon, which just seems ludicrous to me. But
we're at $5.50 here. Last I checked. I actually have to refill my tank, so I will find out tomorrow.
Yeah, and you're not really looking forward to it. Go to Costco. That's the best place.
Yeah. So
yeah.
Well, so we have many things that we could talk about. One of them that I was interested in is you said you were diagnosed ADHD dyslexic when you were 8, and I feel like the understanding of both of those things, really, of ADHD and dyslexia, have changed.
Actually, I should clarify. I've never actually been clinically diagnosed dyslexic, but through my work with Neurodiversity and through the way that words and numbers swim across pages for me, I'm pretty sure that I'm dyslexic. So I just say that as a comorbidity, but it's not official.
Thanks for clarifying. But we accept self-identifications here. I feel like there's so many people who are left out of the traditional.
Yeah. And it costs so much money. It's ridiculous.
Oh, exactly. Like there's all sorts of equity issues around the diagnoses. And, you know, as a woman, you know, with autism, a lot of our traits are in the, you know, what doctors are looking for. So there's all sorts of exclusions. People of color get left out. Everybody gets left out.
Absolutely.
But what I was going to ask is, having kind of had this identity for such a long portion of your life, as opposed to someone like me and a lot of our listeners who were identified in their 30s, 40s, 50s, have you seen attitudes towards ADHD change a lot in the past couple of decades? And like, how do people treat you now versus when you're a kid? Are there a lot of differences?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I've been working on my pregnant pause. How you like that?
It's going really well. I'm not good at that.
Thank you. I think it really depends. I think there's 2 different ways that I see it. I think one way that I see it is through. So to add a little context, at Microsoft, like I co-lead a global group of neurodivergent individuals within our company. And so as I navigate that group, I see it from the perspective of the mass, like you said, the people like yourself who or the listeners who have maybe just recently learned this about themselves later in life. But then I also see this through my own lens of growing up and how I've experienced it. So when I think about my own lens, I think about my experience obviously was heavy for me, but I think that in my sharing of that, it allows other people to like release their own reservations about kind of the grief that they feel about looking back on their lives. Like, oh, I just figured out this thing and now, you know, look what I could have been. And, you know, then there's like this overwhelming shame and all these things. Not to say that doesn't come with both of them, but holistically, I think, especially since COVID, I think that there's a much more broad awareness and acceptance of all things neurodivergent, but ADHD, I think, is always kind of one of those ones where people's like, oh, you know, 1 in 7. And then they're like, well, you're not so special, but it doesn't really matter because I'm not looking to be special. And it doesn't make my brain work any better that you think that you're more like me than you're not. Right. So there's that. But yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but I think it's loosening up. And I think that people as a whole are becoming more accepting that there are actually differences that can add positive values as opposed to setting us apart.
So there is still stigma against a lot of neurodivergences, but you're seeing that at least with ADHD, it's becoming less, at least in certain spaces over time.
Yeah. Yeah, I think overall it's becoming a little better. I think there's still a lot of lost clarity in what does neurodivergent mean? Like, what does that encompass? And why are all these things grouped under there? And is mental health fit in there? Like there's like a lot of gray areas, right? And then another part that I see too is different cultures. So like at Microsoft, we're a melting pot of, everywhere you can imagine. And like in Asia, we don't talk about this. I'll be on a panel in the morning in Indonesia, and I'm like wondering, when I was prepping for it earlier, she's like, the lady who's going to lead the panel was talking about, just try to be, very inspiring to people, that they can support their family, or ask better questions about this thing. And I was like, yeah, but if that's not your culture, if that's like their culture, then I don't want to feel like I'm like over here just spewing my privilege about how cool I am in the United States, about how you guys could do so much better. So but I do know that definitely, and like you were saying earlier, in like minorities and differently represented groups, I think that there is still a lot to come up to, even to where we're at, that we take for granted. So there's a lot of different aspects.
And I've heard from other guests who are located in like Great Britain or Australia, where they are kind of as a group, like, to speak very broadly, where with neurodiversity, especially with autism, which I know a little bit more about, but perhaps with ADHD too, is just like leagues ahead of where the US is generally in terms of support programs, general public understanding, how schools treat it, all that kind of stuff. So
I would say, I've talked to some people in Australia recently who, like, and I don't follow politics or the news or anything at all, but some of the things that they say in the in the Australian political arena are just like so against inclusion that it sometimes is just flabbergasting. I was like, what? So I don't know, like and I think in some ways they're ahead, but in some ways, there's just always different sets discrepancies. Absolutely.
Yep. No, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks. And so you're part of this neurodiversity team at Microsoft. And have you been doing that for a long time?
We started it, I think, about 5 years ago. So it was a couple of us who late at night, like, found some artifact that somebody left over, and we sent a mail to it and nobody ever responded. So we're like, we could do better than this. And so we started building a community around that, and it's become pretty big. So
what are some of the pieces of that? Like, what do you do? What does the team offer for?
So I think the biggest piece about what we offer is the community and the support. And so most of the people that come there that we welcome to the group are like, I never knew this existed, or there's more people like me, and I would have never thought to look for that at work. And so that's like the biggest piece that's most inspiring, I think, to me. And then on the other side of that is, obviously Microsoft has tons of cash. I mean, we pretty much make it ourselves, and it's cool to know that you can leverage a corporation of that size in ways that a lot of places can't do, or a lot of people never can fathom. Like, we create neurodiverse hiring programs, and then we go out into the wild, and like, how can other companies do this? And we share what we learn with them to do that. And then just different ways of inclusion and accessibility and things like that are clearly just privilege levers, but it's really cool to have billions of dollars. You can kind of like toy with things as experiments, and then learn those things and then share them outward. I think that's really cool. But aside from that, it's just hooking people up with accommodations is another big thing. People in the United States anyways, and it obviously differs by region, but the protected class of disability, and if you fall into that, offers you certain workplace accommodations, benefits, things like that. So explaining that and pointing people to get hooked up with those things that they never knew existed is also somewhere that I fills me with joy to do that. But
that's fantastic.
It's cool.
How does Microsoft, I don't know if you know the answer to this, so feel free to redirect me or rephrase me, but so you mentioned the Americans with Disability Act, right? That supports accommodations for people with certain sort of labels, and ADHD doesn't, to my knowledge, fall under that category, right? So how does Microsoft approach, or how does your team approach, I guess whichever level you feel comfortable answering for, kind of inclusivity and support for folks who kind of aren't covered by the ADA but still could use some extra?
I mean, it's another one of those things where we I won't speak for Microsoft, but I kind of will, because it's kind of a thing. Like, it's not official Microsoft talk.
Yes, understood.
But the like, we're in a position where so our mission is to empower everybody in the world to do better, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we kind of take that to heart. So, I mean, we fail a lot, don't get me wrong, but where we're able to, I think that we are able to spread the benefits across the board in a way that is inclusive of everybody wherever we can. So unless it's forbidden by law, you're gonna by and large get the same benefits wherever we are able to give those to whoever. So there's not really a clear delineation of are you official or are you not? It's just your benefits are going to cover. So yeah.
That's all. So you really are coming at it from this perspective that anybody who needs something enough to ask for it or make it known that they would like it can access it without a lot of like proof of.
That's pretty much the verbiage. Yeah. Is you don't have to bring a diagnosis. If it's a reasonable request, they're just going to grant it. Right. And which is cool.
That's awesome. That's because I have talked to so many guests and so many clients too, who have reported a lot of difficulty with their workplace accommodations, even when they come in with a very complex diagnosis and a lot of paperwork to support that. So do you have ideas about, or maybe in your work that you've already done, sort of coming up with these systems and then dispersing them to other companies who want that? What are some of like the basics of a good workplace accommodation plan that have been most helpful at Microsoft, or that you've
so there's I think there's two different sides. There's definitely two different sides that I see contrast. One is due to like labor laws, right? So at Microsoft, we have full-time employees, we have interns that come, frequently every year or so, and then we have what we call contingent staff. So people who vendor or contract to Microsoft, and so our company has what's known as employee resource groups. So ERGs is the acronym for that. Some of them call them BRGs in different companies, but they're basically the same thing. So those are meant for and designed policy-wise for labor laws, and I'm sure there's a whole host of reasons for the full-time employee experience. And then there are what they call employee networks, or let's just call them employee networks, which are kind of more across the board, open and inclusive to include the vendors, because they don't have like specific processes, right? Like they won't have get-togethers that are inclusive or by design exclusive, but the other ones do. So the ERGs have those. So there's clearly two different paths, right? And so we kind of created our neurodiverse spot in the center of that, because we feel like we don't want to out anybody, right? Because everybody should feel included, and that's kind of one of the big dividers of our community and the employee resource group is they allow us to persist because we have kind of defined the model of how to move forward with inclusivity, and we don't have yet we don't have these functions that cross that line, right? And so they allow us to kind of bake in the sun and reap some of the benefits, but at the same time eventually there's going to be a rub where those come together. But I think when I think to both of those sides, I think the most important part is creating a community that is welcoming to its members, no matter what legal bounds there are, right? Like, so for example, if you get into a community and then you feel like, you don't have a safe place to talk, well, what's the point of being in that community? So we try to make it as open and as welcoming and as supportive as we can, without having to, moderate or manage all these policies, or I don't know. So it's tough, but I think community is building that community, that organic community feel, and then ensuring that everybody knows it's a safe, psychologically safe place, and then they'll begin to invest in themselves, and then pretty soon nobody has to own it. It's just it just goes by itself, and I think that's the most beautiful part about it. So if I was standing up frameworks, that's what I would say. And then obviously if you're able, have dollars to back that up and keep it going and market it and all those different things. But
what are some of the practical pieces of making a community feel safe in your experience, at least in this context? Not
for me, it's just constant contact and it's personal authenticity. And so like everybody who I think we're at 3,100 people now.
Wow, that's fantastic.
Everybody who joins our community, like it goes through a request. I see the request, it pops up. I send them a message with a whole bunch of resources in it. and they reply more often than not with hello. I'm like, what do you mean hello? And they're like, oh, you're a real person. And I was like, yeah, it's not just some random robot over here, just and so I think that's probably one of the most key pieces is once they realize somebody's behind the curtain pulling the levers, they're like, oh, this is different than most groups. You get it, you just get some email or something that says you've been joined to the group, and then you're on your own. So I think that the first part is authentically connecting with the people there, and then they realize that this is different than most groups. That's been my my experience utmost. That's probably the biggest one. Second to that is being actively seeking and responding to feedback from everybody in there to make them feel safe. So for example, just last week, somebody was like, oh, we have this like anonymous suggestion box where anything can go in there. You just put whatever you want. And then we read it as like this little group of people. And somebody was like, disclosure obviously is a huge concept across all neurodivergencies, but how come we don't have an automatic or like an anonymous way to ask questions? Because I don't want to out myself by asking this question because I'm new to the group. Oh, well, and then a couple of days later, we create this, an anonymous post thing. And it's just like, you send it here, we'll push some buttons and then it'll post, and we call it asking for a friend. And so it's like somebody actually came up with that idea and then they see that come to fruition and then they know somebody's listening. Right. So it's just like that, those kind of mechanisms, I think, are the most profoundly impactful things that people can find to feel supported.
Yeah, and create trust.
Yeah,
that's fantastic.
Yeah, trust. That's all it is, really, right? Because it's hard to trust a corporation with 130,000 people in it to be having your bet. Big Brother is everywhere, and guarantee he lurks in there. So,
especially for even within that size of a corporation, if your group is 3,100 people. That's a big group, like it must be, I could imagine coming into a group like that. And even if your facilitator, I guess, is very responsive and very authentic, it's still a lot of pressure sometimes to connect with that
absolutely.
Many people,
and like, where do you start?
Where do you start? What do you do?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
It's just like, So, interesting. It is very, but some people you get on the other side who are just off like a rocket. And you're like, look at that one. So you get both sides. But
no, that's true. That's a good point. Do you have any sort of systems in place to support? So like, obviously people with some neurodiversities have this kind of disability lens or are coming from this place of minority group, but you also have like other minority groups in there, right? Like you have people color, you have people from different countries, you have people with English as a second language, all these other things, women. So do you have any kind of ideas, or what have you done to kind of support people who are multiply oppressed in a group like that? That's so, especially at a big tech company where there are certain types of people who tend to have more power.
Absolutely. So God, you're just full of great questions. I think that personally, the best way that I found is, building on top of the kind of things I said, you have to have that safe space where people are willing to interact. Like if you try to hold a forum and nobody wants to talk, you're not going to get anything anyways, right? So if you're able to get people who are either on the top end of just like full open, full throttle, I just want to talk about this, no holds barred. And then you get people who are just kind of, putting their toe in the water to figure it out. If you're able to get those people together, especially in those conflicting like demographics, and then to further that, you look at like the intersectionality between, like, it's really interesting for me because disability sits in the center. It's like a hub, right? Like, of all the other employee resource groups, we have like Blacks at Microsoft, and we have, women, and we have like, OLA and all these different ones, right? But you can be Black and disabled and a parent from the military. Like there's so many different mixes, right? But you have to be willing to talk about that at the center. And so you have to have common ground, but then you also have to have, I heard this term yesterday on a podcast. It was, like if they have a big conference, like they have an agenda and they bring everybody together. Well, now they have this thing with this, I think it's called an unconference, where you just find all of the people and you bring them together and then you say, what do you want to talk about? And they create their own discussion, right? And so that's kind of what you have to have, is like, you can't have a set agenda and talk about ADHD and I'm Black, because that's kind of narrow, right? But if you said I'm disabled and I'm any of these flavors from across this wheel, then you can have a really interesting conversation about how that falls for people personally, and they're more willing to talk about that. So I think that that's the most interesting part about that intersectionality is one, being willing to explore it, two, finding people who will explore it with you, and then three, which actually could be number one, is posing it as an experiment to realize that there's no expectation of this entire thing. Like, we're just going to come together, have a conversation. If we learn something cool, if it fails and we still learn something, well, that's cool. We'll take that away too. And next time we'll make it different or make it better based on what we learn. So
so approaching it from that growth perspective of we'll try it and we'll stretch a little bit, and if it doesn't work, well, we got something out of it. And it might be uncomfortable. So like a lot of the things that we start, at least the way I start a lot of conversations, is I'm probably going to get this wrong. And there's probably going to be people in the group or, in the audience that are going to be like, that guy doesn't know what he's talking about, or, he screwed that up. And that's okay, because I'm at least trying. Right. And if you come with the same, ideal or the same, outlook on it, that growth, like you're talking about, then how can we go wrong? Like we have to be able to explore invulnerability if we want to get anything, if we want to learn anything. So, if you don't want to do that, then go sit somewhere else. I don't want to be there. So, that's one thing you learn as a coach, right? Is how to be wrong and take something from it and kind of move on and go from it, as opposed to getting stuck.
Right.
I don't know.
Coaching's interesting, isn't it?
I really enjoy it so much, and it has stretched me and pushed me, but not pushed me, past comfort zone. Or that's a wrong way to say it. Has pushed me past my comfort zone, but not into the wilds, but more it constantly causes you to stretch out just a little farther, farther.
All that, depending on how far you're willing to go into it, right? That's what's so interesting. Well, what got you into coaching?
Oh, it's Interview Danielle now. I started this podcast. I started this podcast a month or two before the pandemic, and then there was a pandemic. And people are at home, and people kind of found the podcast and the blog and were looking for resources. And it kind of, like, by total luck, because it was a very ADHD thing to start the podcast. I was just like, I'm just going to do this. And I put out like 7 episodes and then went away for a while. And it got, like, not hugely popular, obviously, but it got some traction. And I was like, what is this? And then people started getting in touch and asking if I had resources. And after enough time of doing that, I was like, I looked into coaching and went and enrolled in classes and did all that stuff.
I could do this myself.
There was a dearth, and maybe you've I don't know, we should talk about what got you into coaching next, but there was, from my perspective, a dearth of resources specifically for autistic parents. There was a lot for people parenting autistic children, and some for autistic single people, like youth and young adults. But there was hardly anything for, like, me in my 30s falling over with an autistic kid and, an ADHD kid as an autistic person. There wasn't nothing, anything. So I was like, I'm making this.
Nice work. Yeah.
Well, thank you. What got you into coaching? Because that's a relatively recent development. Is that true?
Yeah, it's in the last year. Actually, what got me into it was, well, it was a host of things, but ultimately what got me into it was also the pandemic. It was, I mean, if I'm being honest, at Microsoft, we have core values, three core values that we espouse: accountability, integrity, and respect. And so right before the pandemic, a year into the pandemic, so in Microsoft, my official career is a software engineer or service engineer, which doesn't matter because who really cares? But so it's engineering, right? Like, coding and all these different things. Over the last 6 years, maybe 8 years, I had a series of events happen where I was able to uncover who I really am and feel comfortable with that at work, which led me to all these different things. But during that time, I kind of holistically grabbed onto these values as something that they resonate with me. And I was like, man, these are really core. Like, this is cool. So I kind of got out of engineering for a little while, and I went to focus on the culture work of Microsoft. Yeah. And this was right before the pandemic hit. And so I was doing this work, and I was, it was like the dream job. Like, I'm like, oh my God, every day I go to work, I'm like, this is the greatest thing ever. And so as the pandemic began to slowly unfold, they realized that, there was going to be economic impact and, all these different things. And so as a company does to isolate itself and its shareholders, they begin to tighten, batten down the hatches because there's going to be a storm. And so, sometimes the first things that go away are, in retrospect, maybe the most meaningful things that you've began to work on, and they're kind of on the fringes. So what happened was they got rid of that position and they said, you're going to have to go back to engineering. And I was highly resistant to that because, I'm at the mountaintop eating the milk and honey. And I'm like, I'm not going back over there. We're just going to be sick for a couple of days and we'll go back to work. It won't be a big deal. Right. And so I went back to engineering. And what I found was that although, I'd been touting or re-amplifying this message of these values, that the people that I had worked for and who, had welcomed me back, they said one thing and did something completely different. And so there was misaligned, and I was like, well, wait a minute. And so it really hit me one day, because now I'm, working in my living room, and, I'd gone away for 17 years to work, and I would come back and, you put on different hats, and my family's here and they're not there. And when I would come home, I'd be, I'd try to put on my, at home Todd face and come back in the house. Well, when you can't escape work because you're working in your living room, everybody gets to see, what really happens, as far as how you carry yourself. And clearly the pandemic added some stress to that. But there was one day my wife was like, you seem so unhappy at your computer, like you're just sitting there pissing and moaning all the day long. And I was like, yeah. And she's like, why? I thought you loved your job. And I was like, oh, well, I don't know why. And so I took a leave of absence for 3 months, and I went and sat in a yurt in the middle of this island for a week or two. And I did a bunch of internal reflecting. And what I realized was what I thought were my values weren't actually my values. And I was trying to adopt somebody else's values and make them fit. And so in doing that, I became completely out of, alignment and, just lopsided in all sorts of things. And so that's what started the entire coaching thing. So I went back to work and I got a performance review that was less than I had ever got in my entire life. And I was like, it's because this is out of whack. And if my values are to build this community, help these people, and, follow my mission, to inspire everybody to be, hopefully better than I've been based on my experience or sharing on my experience, why don't I do something that aligns with that? And so coaching just became the next thing. And so I went in with that intent of monetizing it to get out of this work that I've been doing, which is crazy because like I told you before the show started, like I don't even feel like I should be charging because I'm just trying to do a service, right? And there's a whole dichotomy there. But the most interesting part for me was as I started going through the class, my minimum bar became, I have never really invested in learning about ADHD myself. Like it just got applied to me when I was 8, and I was like, oh, okay, well, I guess I'll take all these drugs and do the best I can. But when they started unfolding, like, here's the neuroscience, here's the tools, you probably missed. And like, it started filling in all these pieces. I was like, man, like, my son's ADHD, my grandkids guaranteed. And so it's like, now I'm like, well, I have a more equivocal stance and ground that I know more about myself, and I know more about how I can help to impact them. And so I'm still meeting my goal. It's just, the target kind of moved. So so that's what got me into it. Really and then now, like I help people at Microsoft. Like we have benefits for coaching and all kinds of stuff through accommodations, but the nuance of where I see myself at Microsoft is because of the length of my tenure there, people are like, oh, well, you must have seen this, or what's your advice on this? So it's a weird quasi, not quite coaching kind of giving advice, which you're not supposed to do if you're a coach, but it definitely fits the demand or like the hunger for that kind of insight. So that's where I'm at now. But
it sounds like the sort of the coach approach, but also like the mentorship, right?
It's a mix.
Yeah,
for sure. Yep.
Yeah, combining those roles is really hard.
It feels wrong because they teach you when you go to coaching. At least that's what I picked up from it.
Absolutely.
Was never give advice. And I'm like, but people want that, right? Like, so it's interesting.
I have been interested as also a neurodivergent coach who coaches neurodivergent people that I try to share information and not advise. Like, I agree with you that generally giving advice is not usually ethical or appropriate. Yeah. But there are some cases where you're like, I'm just going to throw these resources at you and hope that you take from them what I get from them, which is don't do that thing, It's really tricky, especially when you're working with people who are sort of new to their neurotype or new to their understanding of what ADHD or autism or whatever it is. And it's like, you just want to download all this
Yeah.
information for their brains for
that's
them,
so funny.
you know? So
Yeah.
yeah, I have felt that. Yeah.
It's hard. Yeah, but you have to preface it with, do you mind if I share some resources with you?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. You don't just throw things at people.
No.
You know,
Here, do
because
this.
people will meet those resources when they're ready and not before,
Mhm.
right? So there's only
Hopefully.
whatever you
Yeah.
can do. But
Yeah.
yeah. So do you foresee this kind of role of like the mentor coach at Microsoft sustaining you for a bit, or are you still considering shifting into a more sort of, I guess, traditional independent coach role or something else?
No, I think it'll sustain for a bit. So I'm fortunate that I don't know if I was telling you during the show or before, but like my kids are getting old, right? And so like I don't have all of these things, because it used to be, I mean, I still have a mortgage, right? I still have a wife, like spend money, and I like spending money myself. So you become comfortable with like, what you have.
Yeah.
But I could live with substantially less. And and each day I'm realizing, like, for the amount of toil that I put into being unhappy doing the thing that I don't want to do, that I now know I don't want to do, like, what's the where's the rub, right? Like, what's the payoff in that? And so I can keep it afloat long enough, like, to, I'm pretty proficient at my job. So I keep that going in order to do the things that still fill me up. At some point, there will be an unbalance. Is that a word?
Yeah. Imbalance.
Imbalance. There it is. There'll be an imbalance, and then I'll have to choose one way or the other. And it'll probably be more towards helping people, because I'm kind of sunsetting in my life, and that's what fills me up more. So I don't.
Yeah, the service aspect is really fulfilling for me too. So
yeah,
I feel that. Yeah, but you're right. It's hard to balance the income generation with the service aspect.
Yeah. Especially when you see it as a service, right? Yeah. For sure.
Yeah.
We need more people like us, especially like you. They find the spot in the middle, and then they're like, wait, we could do something about that to make that better. I think that's a good trait. So,
well, also just the work that, well, thank you, but also, the neurodiversity group at Microsoft is kind of famous for the in the context of at least these circles, is famous for a good reason, that the amount of resources and like you said, financial capital that's kind of been thrown at this project, but to do some of those kind of testing, experimenting pieces, so that people with less capital or just sitting out here like can still access it. That's so fantastic, and it must be so exciting to be part of that, even if it's not your main job. But just to like,
it's pretty cool. Yeah, sometimes it's interesting, because sometimes it's hard to see the forest through the trees, right? Because the politics is always like ever present. Like, it's always over here, like, hey, we can't really do that. And so you're like, well, why don't we shake it a little bit? And I think that's where it helps to be a neurodivergent individual within the ranks of trying to do neurodivergent work, because you're not constrained by those I'll just question anything, because why? Because I'm just curious. They might not want to tell you, but maybe by you asking that question will change the outcome of what they thought we needed, right? And so I think that's very interesting to think about all the time. But yeah, it's cool.
Yeah,
I like it. If you ever see a spot where we could do better, or you're like, hey, I wonder what Microsoft's doing, you just let me know, because I'll definitely fill you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's your point about that is really interesting, because I also, much more kind of on the ground level, working with individuals rather than with a huge company. But you do see people in, I guess, neurotypical society, neurotypical culture. I don't know how to phrase that, but like there are certain expectations that things will just go this way. And when you question those expectations, a lot of times they will like change their minds, but they just never thought to question the expectation. But then we're coming at it from this outside going, how is this even an expectation? Where did this come from? What is this for?
How many people got together and made this up? Because that's crazy.
And it's just sort of, this is the way it's been, right? And so when you I was going to say challenge, but I think a lot of times we don't even mean to challenge it, right? We're not like trying to take authority over it. We're just sort of like, but
it's
why?
Question. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So that's a really good point.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks so much for being here today.
Yeah,
I
thanks
really
for having
appreciate
me.
it. This was a great discussion.
For sure. Thank you. I appreciate it. Have a good day.
Yeah, you too. Thank you so much for joining us on the Neurodiverging Podcast today. Check out the links below and in the show notes for more information on Todd and his podcast. We have a transcription available for folks who would like it at neurodiverging.com. And if you enjoyed this podcast, please consider putting some money in the pot to support it through Ko-fi, PayPal, or the Patreon. Patreon.com/neurodiverging. Links are all below in the show description. I look forward to seeing you again in the next podcast. And please remember, we are all in this together.